I am going to talk a little bit this morning about the overall trends and issues that are being faced in the USA in local government, and then I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing with some colleagues about a specific type of civic event, a comparative study that we've done. The U.S. has many local governments. We have over 90,000 local governments, and they're categorized as several different types of governments. There are 19,000 cities and 3,000 counties. Those are general purpose governments. And then we have a number of specific purpose governments as well, such as school districts and then special districts. So we have some places that are just a government to run an airport, just a government to run a library, for example, or an electric power district, things like that. There's a great deal of variation across our 50 states and within the 50 states on how the governments are structured and the various functions that they operate. For example, a school district in some places might be a separate government. In other places, it might be the responsibility of a city or the responsibility of a county. So again, a great deal of variation in how these operate and the types of functions that they offer. And it makes it very difficult to study local governments to make comparisons across local governments because of that variation. Our local governments are facing a lot of challenges right now. They continue to. The Great Recession obviously was a big problem financially, which impacted many, many things. And even though we have recovered somewhat from that, there are still a lot of issues ongoing. For example, we have many needs, sort of social needs, public safety needs, infrastructure needs, and there's not enough money to take care of this. Some of this is because the state and federal governments have imposed limitations on local governments in terms of how much they can spend or how much they can tax or the revenues they can take in. And in addition, our citizens are very much in a mood of anti-taxes, so they are very opposed to tax increases. They feel that they're already paying too much for what they're getting, and so they don't want to pay more money to government to provide services. As a result of that, As a result of these challenges, our local governments have had to do a number of things in order to be able to provide services that are needed with the money that they have and do it in more efficient and effective ways. And so there are a number of things and a number of models that have been used in these local governments, but for the most part, I think they relate to one or more of these three things. The first is partnerships. There is increasing efforts to collaborate with other partners outside of the organization. Sometimes this is private sector, sometimes it's private sector donating money to government or individual philanthropists donating money for specific things. Other governments and NGOs are also common partners. Participation is the second mechanism. We have a lot of transparency in our local governments in the U.S., and there are already built-in many mechanisms for participation, particularly for things like long-term infrastructure planning. But it's not enough, and we are trying, in many places are trying new and different ways to improve that participation, including co-production of services with citizens in some instances. And then the third area is performance. There's a very, very large emphasis now on better managing, monitoring, measuring performance in governments. Instead of just assuming that things are good, it's really trying to find the data to measure and determine how well we're actually doing. And there are a lot of different ways that that's being done across the country, such as benchmarking against other governments to see how we compare, getting citizens involved in determining what the important measures are in which to measure governments. And then numbers, my area is public finance, and so I understand that the public doesn't get government finances. They can't comprehend the magnitude or what the numbers are all about. And so there's an effort to do what we call popular financial reports, which try to put the information in terms that average citizens can understand better. So now I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about a study that I've been doing with some colleagues. we've been looking at collaborative governance of civic events, such as annual festivals. I'm doing this with Dr. Dale Crane in my university, and then Dr. Amy Franklin at the University of Oklahoma. We think this is an important topic because it's very common across every community, and because we think that by understanding these issues of collaboration and how these collaborative events work, that it might help us to understand more broadly good governance and how to apply some of these concepts. So specifically at civic events or civic festivals, in many places we call them civic festivals. Again, these are things that every community has. I'm sure Chalet has something on an annual event that you hold every year. They're very important to the community typically for a variety of reasons, such as economics, culture, a social activity, bringing the community together. They involve a lot of resources and typically cooperation among many different stakeholders, and they have to happen by a certain date. So there's a decision process. It can't get bogged down too much in details because the event has to happen. So you have to come to agreement at some point to get things done. But these things do have challenges. So we looked at 3 different events in 3 different countries to begin with. The first one is the Carnival in Salvador, Brazil. Carnival is a popular 6-day event across all of Brazil. Salvador is the capital of one of the states in Brazil. And this again lasts for 6 days. It involves about 1.5 million people over these 6 days in Salvador, and it brings in about $250 million to the local economy. So it's a very important event in that country. The second example is the High Seoul Festival in Seoul, Korea. This again is an annual event. It has grown and become more popular over time. This one started in 1994. The other 2 events have been going on much longer. The third one is the College World Series, which takes place in my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. I think some of you have actually been to Omaha, which is nice. This is a baseball tournament. I don't know if are you familiar with baseball? I know you love basketball. This is a men's baseball tournament college that takes place every year in Omaha for about 11 days. And it's televised across the country. It's very important, receives a lot of visibility, and it brings in about $41 million to the local economy each year. So these 3 events, what we used to look at these is a model by Ansel and Gash. It's a model of collaboration. It's a policy model. And you can see that there are 5 factors that Ansel and Gash use in this model. Starting conditions for the event, for the process, the institutional design, the process itself, leadership, and outcomes. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on each of those and how these 3 events compare across these 5 factors. So in starting conditions, you can see that they all 3 are somewhat similar in that they all have had changes in the goals and in the stakeholders, the influential stakeholders in the process over time. In addition, there have been conflicts among the partners, not surprising, but each of these 3 cases has had significant amounts of conflict among the partners, some of which is due to the fact that there are variations in the amount of power and in the amount of resources that each of the stakeholders holds. The second factor is the institutional design. Each of these 3 events, the design of the process, how this all works, there are formal entities that have been established for the operation and the planning of the events, but the degree to which there is inclusiveness of all the stakeholders and the parties varies a lot among the cases. In some cases, it's much more closed, and in other cases, it's much more inclusive, even of citizens and the public. So there is some variation. We also found that the use of contracts can be helpful in terms of reducing the amount of continuous negotiation that has to take place each year. The process itself has some similarities and some differences. Some of the key things are that the process has changed over time in each of these cases. So it is somewhat iterative. over time, both in the short run and the long run. While there is a shared mission, so all of the stakeholders agree on the overall mission, but they all have different incentives and motivations, so their specific objectives vary quite a bit. And that was true in all of the cases that we found. A couple of things that came across as being very important in our interviews and our analysis is that they all do a lot of evaluation of the event, both at the time it's happening as well as afterwards. So data is very important to understand. How many people are here today? What are they doing? How much are they spending? Those types of things become very important. So data is key. And another key thing, obviously, is communication. You can't have collaboration without communication. We talked about that quite a bit yesterday. And so a lot of dialogue is important, and face-to-face dialogue is important. And then leadership is very crucial in all these cases. In each case, everyone we talked to was able to identify key individuals who were leaders in terms of making these events a success. Sometimes the leader was a government official, sometimes it was not. And so that varied. Government did play a key role, though. And the only one that talked about long-term leadership issues was the one in Omaha, where we had people who were involved in this for a long time, 50 years, and they knew they were going to retire eventually, and so there was some concern with succession planning. In the other two cases, that wasn't that as big a concern. Outcomes. Everyone agreed that it has to be successful. That's the key thing. Everyone says this has to be a successful event, and so they all work to make it successful. And all three of these cases have had successes, although there have been issues along the way, some years not as good as others, and so some changes put into place over time. But each of the events has grown over time. In some cases, very significant growth has occurred. But one thing that was interesting, I talked earlier about the differences in goals between the participants, and what we found is that there's sometimes some tension between the various goals. Sometimes the economic, the money part, takes priority, but that then is in tension with some of the other goals, such as cultural. For instance, the carnival in Salvador is a very, very important cultural event, and so it's bringing together the different cultural components of the community that's very important to some people, and sometimes that gets overtaken by the economic issues. So what does all this mean? We think that the Ansel and Gash model is a good model, but that there are some components that could be looked at more in depth that we found that aren't talked a lot about in the model. For instance, all of these events have had significant, what we call restarts in them, in that they've had major changes at certain times in their history. And so we think that that's an important component. In addition, in some cases, the geographic location makes a difference. In some of these events, most of the stakeholders are local. In the College World Series event, the one in Omaha, one of the major stakeholders is located in another state. And that makes a big difference because they have very different incentives and motivations and interests. And so that affects the negotiations that go on. Infrastructure. In some of these cases, there's a stadium or an arena or something that's a big capital investment. And that makes the difference in terms of long-term planning versus the extent to which you can just do short-term planning from year to year. Again, as I mentioned, the data is very, very important in these events, and that's not talked about as much in the model that we think. And one interesting thing is trust. There's an assumption in all the collaboration research that trust is a really important factor. Trust did not come up in our interviews at all, interestingly enough. Trust itself doesn't seem to be the important component. Other things are important, and they figure out ways to get around trust by having contracts or by negotiating and bargaining. So we think this is interesting and needs more research. Overall, what all of these share are the importance of performance, participation, and partnerships, which, as I said, are kind of the areas that in which we are transforming local governments in the U.S. So we think that this model is useful not just for studying civic events, but that it can be more broadly applied to governance, good governance at the local level. And we would be I have a paper, if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to email it to you when I get back home. And we would also be interested in expanding this if anyone would like to do a case study of someplace in Europe. So thank you very much.